Okay, so Apple has been using machine learning in Final Cut Pro literally since version 10.0, and with recent updates, it's becoming a lot more visible. The goal here isn't to do your job for you. It's to remove the unnecessary steps, workarounds, and busy work that often get in the way. Not because these things were impossible before, but because the amount of effort involved often made them impractical. And that's an important distinction, because while most editing apps are trying to automate the entire edit, Apple seems much more focused on removing friction from the process. In other words, reducing the distance between intention and result. And generating subtitles is actually a really good example of that. But before we jump in, as with previously introduced transcription features, subtitle generation also requires Apple Silicon, therefore, unfortunately, won't work on Intel Macs. And as with the previous update, version 12.3 requires macOS 15.6 or later. And I actually suspect that this is probably the last version to run on Intel at all. We'll see. Because ever since version 10.6, Apple has steadily been shifting more and more features toward Apple Silicon. To illustrate that, here's an overview of relevant features by chip compatibility. Some features are Apple Silicon only, some still work on both, but clearly seem designed with Apple Silicon in mind since they perform dramatically faster there. And only a relatively small group behaves pretty much the same across both platforms. So at this point, the question isn't just compatibility anymore, it's usability. With all that out of the way, let's take a look at the new subtitles.
Apple recently introduced the Transcribe to Captions feature, which enables you to automatically and extremely quickly generate closed captions from any video or audio with dialogue. If you'd like to see more on that specifically, I've linked my previous video on that in the description. But let me briefly explain the important difference between the two types of captions, because that distinction still seems to create a lot of confusion. Closed captions are metadata-based and can be turned on or off later. Subtitles, on the other hand, are actual timeline titles that become part of the edit and can be styled any way you like. Regular captions also live above your timeline, not in it. Depending on which of the three available formats you choose, you get different but fairly limited options for changing their appearance. That is not actually a limitation of Final Cut Pro itself, but rather a limitation of the formats and standards Apple is adhering to. Captions are also meant to be turned on or off later during playback, for example, on your favorite streaming service, something you can also do while editing under the Roles tab in the index window. And in the end, once you're finished, you really only have two options. You can either export the captions as a sidecar file for upload, or burn them directly into the video itself, which means they can no longer be turned off. This is still incredibly useful because you no longer need an external service just to create captions or generate an SRT file. But the first question I immediately saw pop up everywhere was, okay, but how do I make actual titles? Especially the typical animated TikTok-style subtitles that have practically become the standard. Until now, I was left recommending third-party solutions like Caption Animator. But that changes now. Starting with 12.3, Final Cut finally generates both natively. So how does it work? Well, as usual, Apple came up with several unique and clever workflows. In other words, there are once again multiple ways of generating the new subtitles. Probably the most straightforward method is to simply right-click your video or audio file in the timeline and scroll all the way down. Where there used to be a Transcribe to Captions command, there is now Generate Captions, with a fly-out submenu where you can choose between the two types, either closed captions as before or the new open captions. In other words, subtitles. When I select this, Final Cut analyzes the audio for a brief moment, just like with closed captions. And once it's finished, I see what looks like a row of newly created titles above my clip. And yes, as much as it pains me to say it, just like caption generation, this is currently still limited to English language audio. But if you need other languages, stick around, because later I'll show you a couple of very useful tools that help work around that limitation. If I play this back, we can see that this is a fairly generic subtitle that's actually based on the text title from the basic text category. And speaking of title categories, there is now also a new subtitle category where you can find the original title these are based on. Let's select one of the generated subtitles in the timeline and take a look at the inspector. Alongside the usual font selection, size, color, and other options, we also get animation style and animate by controls at the top. These are really the main difference compared to the regular text title they're based on. For example, if I select all subtitles in the timeline and set the animation style to highlight, then play it back,
but then a week later, behaving in the
we
same
can
way
immediately see the
wouldn't
effect.
necessarily be inauthentic because you're actually having a great
Each word is not only highlighted as we go along, but highlighted in sync with what's being said. By default, animate by is set to word, but I could also animate by character, line, or simply animate everything together at the same time. And since I selected all subtitles first, any changes I make affect all of them at once. I can also go down to text color and highlight and fill color and adjust them however I like. But what I think is probably the smartest feature here is the vertical social media safe checkbox. In a 16:9 project, there's not much reason to use it. But if you're working in vertical or square formats and simply turn this on, you'll notice the title moves up and slightly to the left. And if I turn on one of my custom overlays showing all the text and buttons YouTube loves to place over videos, then you can immediately see why. If I switch to my Instagram overlay, matters only get that much worse. But even then, the subtitle sits perfectly above the lower interface elements and away from everything on the right side. And if I switch to the text inspector and justify the title to the top instead, we can see it move down and to the left when I activate the safe option. Very smart and very useful. With any other title, you'd have to reposition everything manually. Now, if you don't like the options you have for styling the default subtitle and would rather use a different title instead, for example, this subtitle glow title that I modified from Final Cut Pro's original glow title to animate faster, then replacing them is very easy. Simply select one or all existing subtitles and double-click the title you want to replace them with. Immediately, all selected subtitles are replaced while retaining the original text.
Wouldn't necessarily be inauthentic.
Although there is one fairly big caveat here, at least at the time of recording this video. If you replace subtitles that were originally generated by Final Cut, you lose the word-by-word timing information used for synchronized animation. So any animated title you use will simply play at a linear pace instead of staying synced to the spoken words. But if that isn't something you need, then you're perfectly fine. Now, you may have noticed that subtitles in the timeline have a darker shade of purple than regular titles. Well, that's because of yet another really clever addition, namely a brand new subtitle role. So what does that actually mean? The subtitles Final Cut generates are automatically assigned this role, and it's also available for assigning to any other clip or media in your timeline. For example, I could right-click my regular title, go to Assign Video Roles, and now below the familiar titles and video roles, we see the new subtitles role. So what is this useful for? Well, just like any other role, once media has been assigned to it and we open the index window, we now see it appear in the video roles section. And that immediately gives us a few useful options. For example, I can instantly turn all subtitles on or off with a single click if I want to export another version of my project without subtitles. Or, if I leave them enabled and export my project, then under the Roles tab in the Export window, I could choose a multi-track QuickTime file and enable or disable them there. Or I could choose separate files and export both the video and subtitles independently. All of that without having to manually create and assign a custom role first. Okay, but what if you don't want to use the default subtitle template in the first place and would rather generate the subtitles using your own template right from the start? Simple. If I go into the Titles browser and right-click the title I want to use as my default subtitle, I still get the usual context menu options like Make Default Title, Lower Third, and if it's a custom title, Open in Motion. But now there is also a new option called Make Default Subtitle. If I select it and go back into my timeline, delete the existing subtitles, right-click my clip once again, and choose Generate Subtitles. Then once they're created and I skim through them or play it back,
But then a week later,
I can see that Final Cut is now using my newly assigned title template. Perfect. The only issue right now, and I'm guessing this will change in the future, is that custom templates currently can't use the original word-by-word timing information. So the text animation itself won't stay perfectly synchronized to what is being said. And that leads us to another useful addition. Not only in this situation, but also if you're interested in creating those fast-paced single-word subtitles that seem to be everywhere these days. Because you can actually control the maximum subtitle length. If we press Command, to open Preferences and go to the Editing tab, we now see two new timing presets, one for closed captions and one for subtitles. By default, closed captions are set to 3 seconds and subtitles to 2 seconds. Think of this less as a strict duration and more as a target length that Final Cut uses when deciding where to split the text into individual captions and subtitles. So if I want each subtitle to contain as few words as possible, I can simply reduce this value dramatically. Let's set it to something like 0.1 seconds. Now, once I close the window, go back to my timeline, delete the existing subtitles, and regenerate. After the new analysis, I now end up with extremely short subtitles that only have enough time for a single word.
Behaving in the same way, you wouldn't necessarily be.
But let's assume you've already created closed captions for your project and even gone through the trouble of correcting transcription mistakes. Now you also want subtitles. The problem is that simply generating subtitles again could recreate the exact same transcription errors you already fixed in your captions, which means you'd have to make all those corrections a second time. Thankfully, there is another option. In this project, I've already generated and corrected my captions. Now, all I have to do is select one or all of them, right-click, and choose Duplicate Captions to Subtitles. The moment I do that, one-to-one copies immediately appear above the timeline as subtitles with no additional analysis required. The only thing to keep in mind is that these subtitle clips ignore the subtitle timing value in Preferences and instead inherit the exact timing and positioning from the original captions. So if you wanted to create those single-word subtitles using this method, you would first need to create the captions using the same shortened timing setting. Another really nice side effect of having an explicit subtitle role is the fact that you can also create subtitle subroles. So how is that useful? Well, again, I have this section of a podcast my daughter Alanis made, a simple two-shot with her having a discussion with her friend. And while individual speakers are not yet automatically recognized by Final Cut, you can, of course, manually assign subtitle subroles to different people. I've already generated the subtitles, and here's where Apple added another little hidden gem. Because if I want to edit all subtitles at once, I first need to select them all. But since I also have B-roll and regular titles spread throughout the timeline, simply clicking and dragging across everything isn't going to work because that would select all of that media as well. Now, there are a couple of ways around this. One option would be to open the index window, though not the roles tab as you might initially expect, because selecting the subtitle role only highlights the subtitles. It doesn't actually select them. Instead, I can switch over to the Clips tab and simply type Sub into the search field. Immediately, all subtitles are filtered out of the list, and now I can simply press Command A to select them all. But there's actually an even easier way. In fact, if you've been wondering how I selected all of the subtitles so quickly earlier without dragging a selection around them, this is exactly how. I can close the index window, select any subtitle directly in the timeline, and, unlike with any other type of media or role, if I press Command A now, only the subtitles are selected. Pretty cool and very clever. Now I can jump into either the title or text inspector and make changes to all of them at once. Or let's say I added additional B-roll after creating my subtitles. That footage will naturally cover the subtitles. But because I can now select all subtitles so easily, I can use another keyboard shortcut that was added fairly recently. I simply select all subtitles and press Option up arrow to quickly move them above all other connected footage. Or, with all of them still selected, I can simply press Command G to group them into a nicely organized secondary storyline. But this gets even better. Here I've created 2 subtitle subroles using the names of the 2 young ladies and assigned each subrole to their respective subtitles. Now if I go into the index window and select either the main subtitle role or one of these subroles, the associated subtitles become highlighted in the timeline. But let's say I want Kiara's subtitles aligned on the left side where she appears, while Alanis's subtitles should appear on the right. Simply highlighting them doesn't help because they still need to be selected before I can make any changes. And I still can't just click and drag because of all the B-roll and other titles. Manually selecting them would become a huge chore. And this is where Apple added another very clever behavior. If I select a single subtitle that has one particular subrole assigned and then press Command A, Final Cut only selects subtitles with that same subrole. How cool is that? Obviously, I can do exactly the same thing with the other subrole. Just select one and press Command A. And if I want all subtitles selected regardless of subrole, I simply select one subtitle from each and then press Command A. Or I can simply press Command A twice. But I'll just select one of Kiara's subtitles. Press Command A, go into the text inspector, and align all of hers to the left. Then I can do exactly the same thing for Alanis and align all of hers to the right with a single click. Very smart and honestly very classic Apple. And if you prefer working through the index window, you can simply enter the name of the desired subrole into the search field to instantly isolate just those subtitles. So, as usual, there is more than one way to skin this proverbial cat. Last but not least, foreign language subtitles. As I mentioned earlier, just like Captions, subtitle transcription is currently still limited to English. Extremely unfortunate and honestly a bit frustrating for people like me, but oh well. On the other hand, there are already a couple of very useful tools that help bridge the gap while waiting for native support, and both work directly with Final Cut Pro. First up is ScriptStar, which I've mentioned in a previous video and which has only gotten better since then. Its main purpose is actually text-based editing inside Final Cut Pro, but I won't go into that aspect here since it would go beyond the scope of this tutorial. Both my friend and ScriptStar developer Ian Anderson, as well as my friend Mark Spencer, have detailed tutorials on it that I'll link in the description. The main caveat for a comparatively simple task like subtitle generation is that the workflow extension itself works with libraries and events, not individual clips. So if I only want a transcription of my finished edit, rather than an entire event full of raw footage, I first need to export my finished project as a single file, which I've already done here. ScriptStar itself is a workflow extension that you open like any other extension through the menu in the top left. Once opened, a window with a drop zone appears where you can drag either an entire library or an event from the browser. I'll drag in this event, which contains some of my various update tutorials from previous versions in both English and German. After a brief moment, I get a list of all contained clips and whether they already have transcriptions associated with them. If I had previously generated external SRT files, I could connect them here as well. In my case, transcriptions of all the English clips have already been created in Final Cut, so I only need the German ones transcribed. All I need to do is select the clips under the New Transcript column. Alternatively, I could click New Transcript to transcribe everything again using a different transcription model. But for this specific use case where I only want transcription and SRT generation, there is actually an easier route. I can simply open the ScriptStar app directly in the Finder and drag only the clips I want into it. Now all I need to do is select and, if I haven't already, download my preferred transcription model under the Show Options button. I'll go with Parakeet. The processing methods are only relevant when using the workflow extension, so we can ignore those for now. I can also define the maximum length of the subtitles with a character or word limit. I'll go with a maximum line length of 45 words, close the options, and click Transcribe Files. Once it's finished, and this is one of the things that makes ScriptStar particularly powerful, I'm given several export options. I can save all generated transcriptions as CSV, Word, or PDF documents, individual SRT files, or even all of them at once. 3 of those options are particularly useful if you want to hand material off to a client for review. But since we only care about subtitles here, I'll simply click Export to SRT and choose a destination. With that, I have individual caption files that I can import back into Final Cut and associate with the clips. I can then duplicate those captions to subtitles, just as we did earlier with Final Cut's own generated captions. The result is a quick and easy way to create subtitles in nearly 30 foreign languages. The second tool I want to highlight is Keyframeless X, and while maybe not the greatest name in the world, it's a really well-designed tool for transcription and custom subtitle generation. It also includes a very unique keyframing system, which is where the keyframeless part of the name comes from, as well as several effects and utility tools. But those are really topics for another day. If you're interested, I'll link to additional tutorials and information in the description because it's definitely worth a closer look. Like ScriptStar, this is also a workflow extension, but whereas ScriptStar works on a library or event basis, this works directly with individual clips or projects. Once opened, I simply drag the clip or project I want to transcribe from my event into the window. I'll drag this project with 5 of my German tutorials onto it. After a short moment, all clips contained in the project appear at the top along with their waveforms. If I want to exclude any of them from the transcription, I can simply deselect them here. Just to speed things up a little, I'll leave only the first 2 clips active. On the bottom left, I can download and select from 5 Whisper and 2 Parakeet transcription models. I can either let the chosen model detect the language automatically or select it manually in the center. I'm sticking with Parakeet once more. Then all I have to do is click Process. After a surprisingly quick analysis, it switches over to the editing interface. On the left, I can see the complete transcription divided into individually timed sections. I can even go in and correct mistakes here, or listen back to sections while the text highlights, allowing me to verify timing and accuracy.
Übrigens ist auch iMovie für iPad und Mac zu 100% mit Final Cut kompatibel.
Again, if you're interested in all the little clever options throughout the app, I highly recommend checking out the dedicated tutorials. On the right side, I have various formatting controls including font selection, color, width, size, and position, all reflected immediately in the little preview window to the right. Most of these are things you could still adjust later inside Final Cut itself, but it's still nice having them available here. What you can't easily change in Final Cut afterward, however, is the maximum number of words per subtitle, or whether subtitles should use 1 or 2 lines. But the best part is probably the style section below. Here you can either download and select one of 5 included animation templates, or even better, scroll all the way to the bottom and load your own custom motion title template to use for the subtitles. Very cool. Once everything looks the way I want, I have 4 different ways of bringing the results into Final Cut. I can save an SRT file and import it as Captions. I can click Import to create a new Captions event inside a selected library with a dedicated Captions project. Or I can choose Paste to FCP to insert the generated captions directly at the playhead position in my active timeline. But my favorite option is Drag to FCP. All I have to do is drag this text field directly into my timeline, and instantly I get a secondary storyline containing all subtitles ready to position wherever I want. That's pretty cool. And if I want, I can even select them all afterward, right-click, assign the new subtitle role, and immediately gain all of the subtitle functionality I showed earlier, though I imagine assigning that role automatically will probably show up in a future update of Keyframeless. And if I don't like something later, whether that's the number of words, line count, or the overall appearance, I can simply delete the storyline, make my changes, and drag the updated results back into the timeline. A really nice workflow overall. So if you like what you saw with either ScriptStar or Keyframeless, and this feels like something that would enhance your workflow, scan the QR codes or check out the links in the description. And just for transparency, neither are affiliate links, and nobody paid me to mention them. I simply think both applications are doing genuinely impressive things and deserve the exposure. Particularly in this context, for those of us who don't have the luxury of working exclusively in English.
So, there you go. Final Cut can now generate both captions and subtitles natively. That may not be the flashiest feature in the update, but it's another example of Apple making a previously cumbersome workflow feel almost effortless. And while the English-only limitation is frustrating, between the new Subtitle workflow itself and tools like ScriptStar or Keyframeless, there are some great options for those of us working in other languages. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Is this something you'll be using, or are you sticking with your current Subtitle workflow? Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your support, and if you haven't seen my AutoMask tutorial, you can find it here, and here another little something you might like. If this helped you and you feel like hitting the subscribe button over here or down below, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.